Hello and welcome back to the Consistory of the Coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Jake Zabel of St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church, located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia, a member congregation of the Confessional Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion, or COELC for short. Today we're continuing my series, Australian Lutheran Synods. Now the purpose of this series is I'm going to go through the different theological teachings of the different Australian Lutheran synods. By that I'm going to include like little independent congregations that are not in fellowship with other groups, but it's more like Australian Lutheran churches and groups, something like that. So what we're doing in this series though is we're going through theological differences. I'm not going through every theological point, but mostly those issues where there has been divergence and splits and fights and arguments. And so this is our first video where we're going to be looking at church fellowship, particularly communion fellowship. And the main reason I'm bringing up communion fellowship is that we're going to discuss prayer fellowship in a later video, but for today we're going to focus on communion fellowship. Now with communion fellowship, there's essentially three different types of communion fellowship. There is closed communion, in which you only commune members of churches that you've declared fellowship with. There is open communion, in which you just commune anyone and everyone. And then there is selective fellowship. Now, selective fellowship can take two different forms. There is the more traditional selective fellowship, which was like a congregationalist-based selective fellowship. This was something that was proposed by the American Lutheran Church to the Missouri Synod back in the mid-1900s when they were dialoguing, when they said, look, our two synods can't have fellowship, but what if like some congregations want to commune Missouri members and some Missouri congregations want to commune ALC members? So it's like closed communion but on a congregational level. So like Synod A may not be in fellowship with Synod B, but some congregations will permit the communing of members from this synod and vice versa. There's also just the more common practice of selective fellowship these days, which sadly many churches who profess to practice closed communion end up just practicing selective fellowship anyway. But selective fellowship on a personal basis is where it is on a personal level. So the pastor will normally commune only those who are members of his church or churches that his church has declared altar fellowship with, but he may make exceptions for certain individuals. And like I said, this is a personal selective fellowship. It's personal to the pastor and personal to the communicant, because it then depends on the pastor as to whether or not you get communion. And when the pastor is giving out communion, he's going to make judgments based on the individuals. And it's kind of a messy practice, I would argue. It's not something that we practice in my church, but that is something that happens in some churches. There's also triangular fellowship, which we'll get to towards the end of the video a bit more. But triangular fellowship is a practice in which there is official altar fellowship between different church bodies, but that a full triangle is not made. So, to explain this easy, imagine if A and B have fellowship, and B and C have fellowship, but A and C don't have fellowship. So, you know, you could be a member of Church A, and you can commune in Church B, and you could be a member of Church C and commune in Church B, but if you're a member of Church A and went to Church C, or Church C and went to Church A, you couldn't have communion. That's triangular fellowship. And so let us actually take a look at what the different synods teach. So we're going to go through this rather quickly. So the LCA has selective fellowship. Now, in my chart that I've got on my website, on the Order of Knight George, going through these different church beliefs, I've put a little footnote because while the LCA's official church policy is a practice known as responsible communion, which is just selective fellowship, in which they will commune some people who aren't members of the Lutheran Church of Australia, while that is their official practice, the LCA in practice basically just has open communion. So on paper, it's selective fellowship, but in reality, it's basically just open communion. Moving on, and this is going to make this episode a bit shorter and quicker, the ELCR, the ELSA, the OELC, the AELC, the CLC, the COELC, the Cassia Aldona Group, St. Jude the Apostle Church in Melbourne, and St. Peter's Evangelical Lutheran Church in Adelaide, that's Pastor Vanderhawk's church, we all practice closed communion, as does the new church body, the Lutheran Mission Australia. They practice closed communion. Now, there's going to be some people out there that are going to say, Pastor Jake, I went to an LMA service and I saw them communing people that still commune in the LCA, so wouldn't that be selective fellowship, not closed communion? Look, I've heard stories. I haven't verified it with my own eyes. But I also know that the LMA is a new church, and sometimes new churches, I don't necessarily agree with this, but sometimes new churches like to have grace periods, and they're a little bit flexible with their closedness of their closed communion when they first begin. So if there are individual congregations out there in the LMA that have been doing a more selective fellowship, that's not their official doctrine, and if you have a problem with that, that's an issue to take up with them. Basically, officially, the ELCR, the AELC, the OELC, the ELSA, the COELC, the CLC, the Cassia Aldona, the LMA, and the St. Peter and St. Jude congregations all officially practice closed communion. Now, there may be some places where they've been a bit loose and they've actually done a more selective fellowship, but at least on paper, all those church bodies confess a doctrine of closed communion, so they will only commune members of their church or members of churches that they have altar fellowship with. Now, as I said, as for churches that practice selective fellowship, on paper, the LCA has selective fellowship. In practice, it's more open communion. But also on paper, the GLN, or Growth Lutheran Network, and the Aletheia, or Allies Church, the Aletheia Lutheran International Evangelical Synod, they, as well as also the ex-AELC independent congregation, so they're the lay consecrationists that split from the AELC, those three groups all practice selective fellowship. That's actually on paper, that's their official practice. They practice selective fellowship. But they will not just commune members of their synod, they will also commune some individuals from other synods. So, for example, the independents might commune some visiting members of the LCA if they're like conservative confessional members of the LCA. As for the remaining groups, this would be the LCMC group in Wagga Wagga, the Edgar Mayer Living Grace group in Toowoomba, and the Living Waters group in Mildura. They all practice open communion. On top of that, Living Grace, that's the Edgar Mayer group in Toowoomba. They also not only practice open communion, but they also practice infant communion, which technically I don't have as much of a problem with, only because the reason we have closed communion is because we base communion fellowship on a confession of faith. So if you're just going to open the communion rail to anyone and everyone who wants communion, regardless of their confession of faith, it seems weird to not also give it to children. Because if you're no longer requiring a confession of faith before you receive Holy Communion, if you're no longer requiring an examination before you give someone Holy Communion, then why not give it to children? Because the main reason we don't give communion to children in other churches is because we can't examine them, because they can't make a confession of faith. In fact, and I've discussed this in my video on infant communion, Luther's teaching of why we don't commune infants is not because they can't believe or that they can't have faith. It's that we pastors can't examine them and make a judgment on their faith, and that it is not right and appropriate for us to just commune people without at least examining them first. So again, LCMC and Wagga Wagga, Living Grace, Toowoomba, Living Waters, Mildura all have open communion, and Living Grace also has infant communion. Now, the last point I want to go through then is the question of triangular fellowship, which I established before. So as I mentioned before, triangular fellowship is where there is official altar fellowship happening between church bodies, but that a church is in fellowship with two other churches that don't have fellowship with themselves. A good example of this would be in Papua New Guinea. There is the Gut News Lutheran Church, which is a member of the Lutheran World Federation, so it has communion with all the members of the Lutheran World Federation. It also has communion with the Lutheran Church of Australia, but it also has communion with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And so the Gut News Lutheran Church communes members from Missouri and members from the LCA, but Missouri will not commune members from the LCA. And so if I was a member of the LCA and I went to Missouri, they wouldn't give me communion. But if myself and a member of Missouri both met in Papua New Guinea, we would commune next to each other in a Good News Lutheran Church. So you can kind of see the oddities of triangular fellowship. Since the LCA has a selective fellowship and essentially an open communion, they don't really practice triangular fellowship. They'll just commune select individuals from other churches they're not in fellowship with. As for those churches that practice closed communion, which ones amongst them practice a triangular fellowship? Well, the ELCR rejects triangular fellowship and currently is not in fellowship with any other synod, so it doesn't matter for them. The ELSA is a member of the Confessional Evangelical Lutheran Conference. That's the international conference started by like the Wells and Els. They are in fellowship with the Wells and Els, and they reject triangular fellowship. If you are a member of the CELC, the Confessional Evangelical Lutheran Conference, you are in fellowship with all members of that conference. So it's not like Wells is in fellowship with the ELSA in Australia and some other synod. No. If the ELSA is in fellowship with the Wells, they're also in fellowship with all the other synods Wells is in fellowship with. The OELC also rejects triangular fellowship, but they don't have any other synods they're in fellowship with. The AELC also rejects triangular fellowship. They are currently in fellowship with the ULMA and the ACLC over in America. And so the AELC is in fellowship with those two church bodies, and those two church bodies are in fellowship with each other, and they are not in fellowship with anyone else. The CLC also rejects triangular fellowship. The St. Jude's congregation in Melbourne rejects triangular fellowship. My synod, the COELC, rejects triangular fellowship, and at this point in time, we're not in fellowship with any other synods. The Cassia and Eldona also reject triangular fellowship, and Cassia in Australia and the Philippines is only in fellowship with Eldona in North America. And I think there were some South American congregations they were in fellowship with, but again, all those groups are in fellowship with one another. As for St. Peter's in Adelaide, that's Pastor Vanderhawk's church, I don't know. I've not actually gotten an answer out of him in regards to triangular fellowship. I would assume he doesn't support triangular fellowship, but I don't know. That would be a question to ask him. As for the LMA, again, a similar thing. I have not got clarification from Pastor Matt Anker as to whether or not the LMA would participate in triangular fellowship. However, the LMA has joined the International Lutheran Council, the ILC, and there are many synodical bodies in the ILC, such as Missouri Synod, which we've already pointed out, do practice triangular fellowship. And I also know that LMA has a lot of close ties with Missouri Synod, and if they haven't already, they would be seeking fellowship with Missouri Synod. So very likely the LMA will, like the LCMS, also practice triangular fellowship. So out of all the church bodies in Australia that practice closed communion, basically all of them reject triangular fellowship except for probably the LMA. Again, I don't have 100% clarification from LMA that they would practice triangular fellowship, but it seems unlikely that they would reject it, since they've already entered into fellowship with the ILC and that they're looking at working with Missouri Synod, which does practice triangular fellowship. So I can assume that the LMA would probably just follow in their footsteps. That basically wraps up this video on communion fellowship. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.